The little boy is 4 years old. He goes to day school. His mother dropped him off for class the other day, and at the end of the day school period, the end of the day, the mother went back to pick up her little boy. When he got into the car, she said, "Well, what did you talk about in school today?" And the little boy said, "Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Ben Carson." And the mother's eyes got so wide, and she looked at her son. "Did your teacher discuss all of this with you?" "No, Mommy, but she tried to stop me." As it turns out, that little boy has a very, very opinionated and very vocal daddy. I know this to be true because his great-grandmother told me this story just yesterday. The readings today are about who we are now and about the future that we are preparing for our world, for ourselves. So let's just dive right into these readings and find out who we are and what type of future we are preparing for our world. This first reading from the book of Genesis is actually the second story of creation. In the first story, the first chapter of Genesis, God creates in 6 days and he rests on the seventh day. And at the end of each of those days, God looks up and says, "It is good. It is good." In the second story of creation, God has created the world, and at the end of the day, he looks up and says, "This is not good." Well, how can that be? God is the one who created it. God can't do anything wrong, so how in the world is it that God can look up and say, "It is not good"? Well, what God is referring to is the isolation, the loneliness, the singularity of the man. This is not good. So after God has shared all of his authority and his creative responsibility with the man, God takes from the man a rib, and he fashions out of that bone a creature who is very much like the man, though different. He presents woman to man, and man says, "This one is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one is my companion, my helpmate." God, in this reading and in our Christian theology, shares his authority and his creative responsibility with mankind, with man and woman. But look what the writer of Genesis says. God cast a deep sleep on the man. He took one of the man's ribs. But interestingly enough, the word that's used, even in Aramaic, is a very, very fascinating word because it's not Aramaic. Scripture scholars think that it might well be a word that was taken from the Sumerian people. The word is selah, and in Sumerian it means rib, but it also is the word meaning life. Isn't that a revealing idea? That God, casting a deep sleep on the man, took life out of that man to create new life, woman. And then he gives the two to one another that they may be one humankind. What this passage from Genesis is saying to us is that God has created man and woman equal and complementary. They are equal because they are both human beings created in the image and likeness of God, and they are complementary because man cannot be woman, woman cannot be man. It takes the two of them together to be the image of God present in the world this day. To continue to exercise the authority of God and the creative responsibility of God. From the very beginning, God created unity. And from that unity, God makes himself present in the world so that that unity continues to exist and to thrive in our world today. Now let's jump to Mark's gospel, because Jesus in this gospel passage protects the unity that God created. The Pharisees, who are always looking for some way to trip up Jesus and to find some reason to get rid of him, we'll get to that later, want to know about the issue of divorce. At the time of Jesus, there were two basic schools regarding divorce. Each school was headed by a rather powerful preacher and Pharisee of the day. One school taught that divorce was virtually impossible, and that she, the woman, had to be caught in the act of adultery, and there, witnesses in the whole 9 yards, so that the husband could write her a bill of divorce and get rid of her. The other school, far more lenient, if she didn't cook well and you weren't satisfied with the meals that she put on the table, you simply wrote a bill of divorce and got rid of her. God, I think that sounds rather 2015, doesn't it? Jesus, in teaching the disciples and in teaching anyone who had the ears to hear, is protecting the unity that God created from the very beginning of the world. He goes all the way back to the book of Genesis with his citations. God intended it to be this way, to be united, to be the image of himself in the world. And Jesus goes on to teach that man, who is the weaker, the strongest by law, Jewish law, it's a very, very patriarchal society, that man had every responsibility to protect what is weaker by law. So the husband had every responsibility to protect his wife because she is weaker by law. And Jesus carries that one step further when he places a child in their midst. He caresses and blesses that child And I would dare to say that it's probably a little girl, because little girls were absolutely the lowest person on the totem pole. They were useless. In Jewish culture, they were useless. They were treated often like slaves. Jesus blessed that child, caressed her, and used her as an example of the greatest that God creates. So in the gospel passage, in protecting the unity that God has brought into the world, Jesus places the responsibility on the shoulders of man to protect those who are weaker by law, the woman and the children of the community. That's who we are now. Having been baptized and confirmed in our faith, called here every Sunday so that we can celebrate Eucharist and give thanks for who God has created us to be. We are equal and complementary. We are united, so that we present to the world the image of God, present and active, responsible, creative human beings. What are we teaching our children? Because if we can answer that question, then we know the future that we are establishing for our world. And our culture today is a disposable society. If it's inconvenient, we get rid of it. If it doesn't work, we get rid of it. If it's old, we want something new. Anything that stands in our way is useless, and therefore we get rid of it. We murder babies because they're inconvenient. We allow old people to live alone and to die in their beds or at their tables because it's inconvenient to go and take care of them and to help them. If it doesn't work, we throw them away. If I can't understand the language that the people from Syria speak, then obviously they have no value in life. In a disposable society, the only thing that matters is me and my convenience and my own short-lived happiness. Just me. And when that becomes the rule, we find out just how intolerant we can be. And we'll spend massive millions building walls around ourselves so that no one can be as good as I am. We live in a society that will spend hundreds of dollars every year buying dog food, but we won't give to the beggar under the bridge, the human being who needs our help. What are we teaching our children? And we can talk at home all we want about Scripture, about what Jesus calls us to. But the minute we begin to act contrary to that truth, we have taught our children that we and others are disposable. What's going to happen to us when we are old? When we no longer work and produce? When it's inconvenient to take care of us? It all depends on what we're teaching our children.